All right, welcome back, everyone, as people roll in from the waiting room. It's 10:31, and so I'm going to get started introducing our next panel, starting with our moderator, Brian Fanning. Brian Fanning is Professor of Migration and Social Policy at University College Dublin. Since his first book, Racism and Social Change, in the Republic of Ireland in 2002, he's led a number of research projects on the experiences of immigrants and on how immigration has changed Irish society. Most recently, he is the author of Migration and the Making of Ireland, published by Indiana University Press in 2021, and Diverse Republic, also in 2021, published by the University College Dublin Press. And as you can see from his bio, he is the perfect person to moderate our next talk. Brian?
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody at home and in all the places around the world where you are. I'm delighted to welcome Elisa Joy White, who is Associate Professor of African Diaspora Studies, Black European Studies, and many other kinds of migration and diversity related studies, and who is giving us a paper today based on her own, I think, path-breaking research on migration in Dublin. Ireland has gone through 2 decades now of rapid change as a result of immigration. And Professor White's work comes in at the very, very beginning of this, because we now have a flourishing African community in Ireland. And she did research at the very, very beginning of this, at a time of their first initial arrival in Dublin. So it's going to be fascinating to hear her reflections, on this, which of course was also part of the subject of her book, Modernity, Freedom and the African Diaspora, Dublin, New Orleans and Paris, which was published by Indiana University Press in 2012. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor White to speak to us now. Thank you very much indeed.
All right, good morning.
Yes.
Good morning, good morning. Thank you very much for that introduction, Brian, and just wonderful to meet you again in this way. I just first off just want to say thank you very, very, very much to Kim DaCosta, and certainly also to Miriam, Nyhan for bringing this together, NYU, Gallatin School, Glucksman Ireland House, and all those behind the scenes who are making this happen. This has been an exciting conference, and I'm just very happy to be a part of it. And so we continue today. I'm going to now do a wonderful thing called sharing the screen here, and as we do in Zoom land, and make sure everything is fabulous here. Let's see. Let's make sure. I think we're good. Yay. No gremlins. The talk today, as you see, is called Taking Back Céad Míle Fáilte, When Blackness in Ireland Seemed New Again. And I'm going to give you a bit of a description of my talk here first off. So I'm going to read a bit and then we'll move forward. But I want to give you a sense of what I'm exploring here. As Brian noted in the introduction, I landed, if you will, in Ireland during a time of a significant new presence of people of African descent, of the African diaspora in Ireland. A very exciting time, and a very exciting time for various reasons, as we'll discuss today to some extent. But I'm going to just give you this introduction just to give you a sense of where I'm going or hope to get to before we finish this presentation today. This talk reflects on the transitional period of relatively substantial in-migration of Black and African diaspora communities to Ireland at the top of the 21st century, and its relation to earlier notions of inclusive Irishness, as well as related national and transnational discourse. This reflection draws on field research that I conducted, as noted during those early 2000s, and my positionality as a researcher at the time, as well as considers what Ireland during that period presents for more recent understandings of global populism, anti-racism movements, and contemporary renderings of community and belonging. And I just want to say, I did not see all of Micheál Singh's presentation, unfortunately, but I did catch the end of it. And I'm hoping that there is also some resonance around these discussions of white supremacy and populism that come to mind, even as we consider this very specific period in Ireland in those early 2000s. So why taking back? I'm a bit cheeky here. Taking back Céad Míle Fáilte, those 100,000 welcomes. The idea, of course, is that there is a sense that welcomes are given. People are invited to come into a space. In this case, to arrive in on the Emerald Isle, and in this more specific space, to arrive in the Republic of Ireland. And with that, there's a long history of the Irish in spaces that might entice individuals to feel welcome in spaces of Dublin and beyond. And of course, the population that I consider the African diaspora in Ireland during this particular time predominantly was coming from Nigeria. The second largest group was coming from the Congo, that is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so that large population of individuals coming from Nigeria, and just a note, Brian, of course, explores this in his new book that has an excellent chapter on that point of migration as well, looking at migration in Ireland during that period. But that substantial presence of individuals of the Nigerian diaspora, if you will, is part of also the Irish diaspora being in Nigeria and having connections with spaces of Igbo communities and Yoruba communities, particularly also significant in the Igbo context with the Biafra movement, 1967. All of these kinds of things intersect, of course, as we think about Irish philanthropy, Irish humanitarianism, and of course the clergy in spaces of Nigeria representing the Irish diaspora in a particular way that says Ireland is welcoming. We are helping you, we are with you, and we know that you belong with us somehow. And so that is one reason, one of many, of course, for this substantial in-migration when we think of the early 2000s, particularly of individuals coming from Nigeria. So the taking back of the welcomes is that once individuals have arrived and you have a significant impact of people of African descent, Black people arriving in the Republic of Ireland during this time, suddenly they find they are, well, not so welcome. And that, of course, is why, in a cheeky way, I'm saying taking back Céad Míle Fáilte, taking back 100,000 welcomes. So why the question of when Blackness was new again? Well, welcome to Dublin unless you're Black. This is an article in the Irish Times, as you see, from April 24th, 1999. And with that, you see abuse of and violence against refugees and ethnic minorities are on the increase. This is 1999. Black visitors to Ireland have been warned. The latest edition of the Rough Guide to Ireland, the best-selling guidebook that is consulted by young people in particular, says this state is, quote, shamelessly intolerant of minority groups, end quote. So here you have this grappling with that tension between welcoming Ireland, a welcoming place, and an unwelcoming place, particularly for Black visitors. And as we see subsequently moving along, as we get into the 21st century, we see it becomes even more unwelcoming. And that is not only backed up by a perception, but we see increases of racist violence on the streets. We see also underlining policies that forestall the presence of regularized Blacks, then forestall the sense of equality and human rights, which we'll get to in this discussion in Ireland. But that is part of the taking back, and also the question of what is new here. Why it was new again? Well, it's new again, and certainly we can say it's new again because of this. And I know many of you, hopefully all of you, had a chance to see Christine Keneally's excellent talk last week. I know that will be recorded. I think she might even be in the room here today. And yes, Black Abolitionists in Ireland. This is a review from 2020. an excellent review, and she does look at 10 abolitionists who were in Ireland. So Black presence was not new. We see that certainly in the 19th century during this heightened human rights movement, individuals seeing human rights violations in the spaces of the United States, going to Ireland and saying, this is something that is a global issue, and getting sympathy, help, assistance, all in the context of Irish philanthropy, but also in the context of a simpatico, if you will, with different spaces of Irish oppressions and experiences of lack of freedom in various ways as we think about it. So not new in that sense, certainly not new. And just a note, the talk last week specifically addressed Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield and Sarah Parker Raymond, two African-American abolitionists who were in Ireland. So arrival. This highlights an arrival of certainly of individuals of African descent coming at the moment in the late 1990s into the top of the 2000s, that turn of the century. And again, coming for some of the reasons I've already noted, a sense of understanding that Ireland would be a welcoming place, but also we have this global economic context. And there was some talk I heard towards the end of the previous discussion about these forces of globalization, these intersections. And most certainly this moment in Ireland at the top of the 21st century is a point in which Ireland is perceived and conceived as the quote unquote Celtic tiger. And that, of course, is taking from the sometimes pejorative representation of the quote unquote Asian tigers as Ireland becomes known as an economic powerhouse, if you will, at the time, and becomes a place in which there's an increase in technological industries. There are different, an increase in incentives, of course, to bring to encourage multinational corporations to arrive in Ireland. And with that, with economic globalization, you have the social and cultural globalization that is always paired with those processes. People move, right? And they move with the money, and they move for opportunity, and they move to sustain a healthy and dignified life. And so Ireland becomes that destination. That's the arrival of the substantial Black and African diaspora community. Also, there's an arrival, as I said, some of this talk will also have the subtext of me engaging with my positionality as a researcher. And my arrival is in 2000. My first visit to Ireland was in 1999. And I went to have a look-see, if you will, to see what was going on in Ireland. I was doing a lot of work considering transnationalism and the cultural and social dimensions of globalization. And with that too, I was looking at the 19th century United States and considering the draft riots and the Civil War and conscription and all of these questions, some of which certainly we discussed last week in some of the last week's sessions, but thinking about Black and green relations, if you will, but certainly of the Irish migrants who were in the United States and individuals of African descent and those conflicts, and then also the less contentious conflicts, communities that emerge in spaces of New York City and Five Points, and also in spaces of Boston as well. We see those Irish and African diaspora connections occurring in the context of the United States, even amidst these tensions, right? So I was interested in that, but I was again thinking about contemporary globalization. I said, well, with this Celtic tiger economy, what is happening now? What is the Black population in Ireland looking like? Is Ireland a space of in-migration after so many years of being a space of out-migration? And people looked at me, and I always tell this joke, but I'll tell it again. People said, you're not going to see anybody. I asked the question, are there any Blacks in Ireland? Which is an absurd question, but you ask that question because people are looking at you askance. And they said, yeah, you'll arrive, look in the mirror, and then you'll say, yeah, there are Blacks in Ireland. Bump. And so there's a bit of the humor there. But of course, I arrived in 1999 and saw a population emerging and thought, this is something to examine. It's telling us a lot about communities, about race in a very new sense, and particularly because Ireland has always had this, been a space of out-migration. for its own circumstances of whether you define it as post-coloniality, British subjectivity, anti-Irish racism, or the negative racialization of the Irish, which I will describe in those terms as I go forward today, considering that intersection. I know last week during Kevin Kenny's presentation, there was a discussion of Irish whiteness, and of course, and Kim DaCosta had a play with that in her presentation, how the Irish became Black, playing on Noel Ignatiev's How the Irish Became White. And so again, this idea of whether there is racism against Irish, are the Irish experiencing racism, however you might define it here, and I'm not going to extensively discuss it right now. I will say that they've been negatively racialized. So it's interesting to see the arrival of Black communities that are also negatively racialized in particular global contexts, and how that intersects with the circumstances of Irish welcoming and philanthropy and so forth. This eventually becomes, as noted in the introduction, my book, Modernity, Freedom, and the African Diaspora, Dublin, New Orleans, and Paris. The first half of the book specifically looks at Dublin and environs in Ireland more broadly during that time that I mentioned. And then the second part of the book looks at events in 2005, that the Dublin specific component of that involves a roundup of individuals with a precarious status in the state, roundup and deportation of around 34 individuals of African descent back to Nigeria that occurred from Ireland in 2005. So all of this is to say, as I arrived and as I began this process, eventually I thought about questions of what modernity meant and what it means in the context of Ireland in this contemporary space, and trying to make sense of it as part of the process, making sense of the society. I theorized it as something I termed a retro-global society, Ireland as a retro-global society, in the sense that it was had all of the, as I say, the accoutrement, what global societies of the 21st century are supposed to be. Dublin has internet cafes at the time, and Wi-Fi's everywhere, and everybody's on their mobiles, and it's all this technologically progressive space, right? You see me using my inverted commas here. But at the same time, it's somewhat retrogressive, and its engagement with Black communities, with issues of racism, and with just the general arrival of Black people in the space, as if they are not only an anomaly in terms of the structure of how one visualizes Ireland, walking the streets of Ireland, but also in the sense of the construction of Irish identity. So you have this clashing of communities and a clashing of experiences that is a global, contemporary 21st century global society meeting a retrogressively, socially retrogressive society in its engagement with race and racism, because for the first time, it is experiencing a substantial presence of that population and navigating that. And it's happening quite quickly. I describe it as a social laboratory, a soc lab of sorts that's occurring at this particular time. Multiculturalism, activism, anti-racism, those are what's happening at the time. And I note these, and these are prompts for me to help me stay on point here with you, but also so that you can see that those are the overriding areas of discussion that occur once you have this arrival of individuals of the African diaspora. Multiculturalism becomes a buzz term. It's also multiculturalism in academic spaces. Multiculturalism is being theorized very much at the time. I always note Cynthia Willett's work on theorizing multiculturalism, but in many spaces, there was an idea of how do you have multiculturalism? Can it be defined as interculturalism? How do communities construct an identity of many cultures equaling one? All of these questions were coming to the fore very much so during this time. But with that, you have substantial spaces of activism. And that's an exciting part too, because it's not that the activist groups were not there beforehand in Ireland, but if anything, when we think about a substantial presence of anti-Black racism and the violence that emerges, it gets directed towards the new community. And also because it's the activism is countering anti-immigration sentiments. And again, all of these measures that place and marginalize Black people in their presence. So you had the anti-racism campaign, ARC emerges. founded, one of the founders, the late Pat Guerin, is certainly a part of this movement. And you have the Anti-Fascist Action, AFA is there, Residents Against Racism, RAR, all of these groups are happening at the time. Some are grassroots, some are quangos, quasi-NGOs, some are NGOs, some come from European bodies, EU bodies. You have also Irish Refugee Council is happening at the time, the IRC, it still is. And ENAR, European Network Against Racism, then has its arm, Irish Network Against Racism, also emerging during this early period. All of these circumstances are combining to construct a way of understanding how you get to multiculturalism, but also how you, on the other end, get to anti-racism. And this predates the kind of discourse that we have in the United States right now about what it means to be an anti-racist, or different lesser informed and very ill-informed understandings of what anti-racism is, or critical engagements with that are part of our current public discourse in very anti-intellectual ways. But in the anti-racism movements, and we think of Europe, certainly in Europe broadly, but in specifically thinking about Ireland, you could have a discourse about anti-racism in a way that even in the late 90s and the top of the 2000s in the United States, anti-racism was not the way it was perceived. It was about equality, anti-discrimination, perhaps, but to be anti-racism was if anything, aggressive in the language that we would see in the United States in particular ways, but it was very much to the fore in the Irish context, and I would argue in other spaces, certainly in the UK and other areas too, during this time, and continues. So that is part of what the groundwork looks like as we arrive in Ireland at this time. Asylum status, of course, is the predominant measure here. Overwhelmingly, individuals of African descent are seeking asylum during this particular time. And there are tensions between the question of economic desire for migration, the economic desire, which is paired against the humanitarian desire to seek asylum vis-a-vis the Geneva Convention and certainly the UN criteria for seeking asylum. I would certainly argue that all of these circumstances intersect, and they are not neatly delinked, even as today in 2021, we persist in trying to do that, to qualify migration and reasons for migration, putting people in different camps depending on why we think they are worthy of being in a particular space. We see this globally, and certainly throughout Europe, that is an issue. This particular magazine, the Irish Refugee Council, would examine these issues of asylum and this particular status in various ways, and advocate, of course, for asylum seekers, and that was happening very strongly at this time and continues. Here you see, to get a sense of the context, this is from 2002, this particular edition. You see refugees, asylum seekers, and racism in Ireland. So you see the reduction of Black identities overwhelmingly to a status, a migration status, refugee, asylums, and racism. But that is the reality here. And you see in this picture in the middle here, taken from a Dublin street, no remorse, and refugees, wake up here, refugees, fuck off. And I guess I could say feck off to be a little more polite, but you can read it. So there we are. And here you have no remorse. And then of course you have swastikas, anti-Semitism at the fore, intersecting with other symbols of hate. This is 2002, and all in the context of the arrival of individuals of African descent in the welcoming spaces of Ireland at the time. But with that also you have different types, as I noted, of activism. This is a slide from a SARI video, that's SARI, Sport Against Racism in Ireland. And this particular video, A Letter Home, and just in the interest of time, I won't play it, but you can still find it online on YouTube. And it features an individual of Nigerian descent, a Nigerian man reading a letter. And the letter is talking about really racism and bias and discrimination that he's experiencing. And of course, the issue is that he's not reading something from 2000, 2002 Ireland about his experiences as a Nigerian in Ireland. He's reading about someone from Ireland who is in the United States, in either Boston or New York at the time. And then at the end of the video, you see the tagline, "We didn't like it when it happened to us." So again, overwhelmingly, interestingly, you have this intersection of understanding the Irish diaspora history and those spaces of oppression, of negative racialization, of British subjectivity, all of these circumstances, and then going abroad, whether it's going to Liverpool or going to Boston or New York City, having this bias, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish occurring. And again, reminding the Irish of the 21st century, we didn't like it when it happened to us. So why are we doing this is the question. Criminalization of migration and a two-tiered society. That is an overwhelming aspect of the experiences of individuals of African descent, of Blacks in Ireland during the particular time, because as noted, because of the issue of seeking asylum, because of coming through the lens of seeking migration status and having to be regularized or have your claim of asylum founded, there was a criminalization process automatically because it goes through the Garda Síochána. Immigration at the time goes through the police, right? And so if your first engagement as a migrant, even as you're seeking asylum, as you're fleeing harm, as you're fleeing various circumstances of violence, crime occurring in the homeland, political violence, FGM, female genital mutilation, whatever it might be, as harsh as it might be, upon arrival, you are met with the police. And that constructs automatically a two-tiered society in which individuals of African descent are not going to fit in automatically or be seen as seamlessly fitting into the society in the way that individuals of the Irish diaspora eventually were able to in spaces of the United States and in Britain. Yes, we know those conflicts are still today. I'm not certainly understating that everyone of Irish descent feels so welcome in all aspects of London and other spaces, or in spaces of New York and so forth. But most certainly we can say in the 21st century, the regularization process has evolved for them from those 19th century days, and that is not the case in the 21st century for Blacks in Ireland. So this criminalization process is part of creating the two-tiered society, and then of course having the status of migrant through the lens of asylum is also part of that function. And so with that, you had vis-a-vis the multicultural activism, you have the Garda getting involved, the Garda Racial and Intercultural Office that emerges at the top of the 21st century. And you can see this particular newsletter, and you see in the corner there, meeting the challenges of diversity, right? And so meeting those challenges, diversity is perceived as a challenge to be diverse, to be a diverse Ireland. There are all these kinds of challenges one must surmount to get to some type of stasis or some type of multicultural definition, or something intercultural as it might be defined, making those connections. And the Garda, even as they police migration, realize that there is an engagement with the community that needs to be had. And that comes into that understanding emerges not in isolation. It's about the political optics of how Ireland is perceived in its own imaginary, right? And it's also about those activists that I mentioned before, pushing for change in that process. This is on Garda Síochána Human Rights Initiative 1999-2000. You see policing and human rights promoting best practice. So this is a booklet, a program that emerges to deal with these best practices, because you have individuals arriving, seeking asylum, and telling their stories, hoping that they will be received into the state and eventually end up having a status, permanent status, or resident status in the state, a refugee status in various contexts in terms of UN criteria. But you have individuals who are policing who don't know the community, who don't have a history of engaging with these human rights violations, some of which I just mentioned briefly before. And they're determining whether somebody is going to be harmed or not in the state. And so here you have this change in policing and human rights. And this conference, the 3rd to the 4th of November, 2000, at Dublin Castle, occurred, yes. And so, yes, I was at that conference, and there you had a series of panels in which this issue of human rights violations and how the Garda, how the police can engage these circumstances. And think about this, because in the 21st century, we are thinking about how policing occurs. The United States context, most certainly, in Ireland, we are thinking about it in spaces of the UK, in France, in Italy, across. Most of my work is in Black European studies, so I'm thinking of European context, but how the police work is the question, and how they work in conjunction with Black and brown bodies in the society. So here you see this engagement at the top of the 21st century in Ireland at Dublin Castle. Representative identity reductions. That's part of the issue. Asylum seeker, refugee, Nigerian. That's what Black identities are reduced to in all their complexity and diversity. This is what one becomes. As a researcher, working on back in the day, I was in Ireland on a Fulbright PhD student working in my doctorate at UC Berkeley. There I was living in Dublin, right in the core of that community, the emerging community of Parnell Street of the Black community, shortly for a little bit of time, called Little Africa. I was right there. And even in my own identity and who I am and my understanding of where I am and an African-American in this particular context, the fast reduction or the assumption to asylum seeker, refugee, or Nigerian would be applied to me as well, right, in a particular way, regardless of my status or shall I say, privilege in this particular context. And so I was always very conscious of that. And then, of course, you open your mouth and they hear you, and somebody says, where'd you pick up that accent? Well, okay, New York, somewhere. But the point is that even then, understanding whether you were there permanently or passing through was very much important as one navigated the questions of Black identity in Ireland during this time. But overwhelmingly, individuals were described as asylum seekers. Oh, this asylum seeker is walking down the street, or this refugee came forward, or Nigerian. And this would be in the media, this would be in common parlance in the pub, this would be in various forums. And so that is also part of the story of the Black experience at the time, creating that two-tiered society. Just giving you an example of that two-tiered society, as well as that you had individuals placed in housing through the direct provision scheme. And the direct provision scheme had first initially in some of the B&Bs in the center city, Dublin, particularly in the North Dublin, you had asylum seekers housed in these spaces. Eventually, they were spread out throughout the country because of discourse around creating quote unquote American style ghettos and other types of concentrations of Black individuals. So they were spread out throughout Ireland into the countryside, north and south, in the Republic of Ireland, I'm saying when I say to the north. And that changed the dynamic, but it also created an increase in isolation for Black communities. And so there's where you also have the issue of racism and human rights, and this marginalized community is brought forth. And with that, you had, with the direct provision scheme, asylum, those seeking asylum were given before the euro was implemented. You had, they received 15 punts a week. That's 15 Irish pounds a week, and $7.50. You have £7 and 50p for each child, and eventually after the euro, it becomes 19 euro and 10 cents per week and 19.60 per child. And so not a lot to sustain one's existence, but they're stuck in the hostel, in this space, hostels being former B&Bs, former places of Irish welcoming, become, if anything, spaces of detainment and internment. People are free to go out and roam, but they're not free to work. And that continues to be an issue. So in these accommodation centers, as they become termed, you see these different circumstances. And I put this on the screen from Modernity, Freedom in the African Diaspora. And just to look at it quickly a little bit here, one individual, Frida, is saying it is one room per family. I cannot make my own bed, which is important because I have diabetes. I've submitted 4 letters from my doctor requesting independent housing. Some people told me to take more sleeping pills to relax and relieve the stress rather than just offering me new accommodation. All of these circumstances are what's occurring at the time. Down here, you have Talia from Sierra Leone. We asylum seekers are so scared that we do not know when to speak to each other. Some people just have so much on them, they can't even speak to each other. They just walk with their heads down sometimes. So again, you have these mental health distresses, you have this isolation, you have individuals unable to work. Eventually, this is in 2000, 2001, eventually as years go on, there's a backlog of manifestly founded cases. Ireland is lagging in accepting asylums, accepting asylum claims. Some individuals slip out of the system into the community, but again, they're not able to legally work. Individuals do find extra legal, if you will, ways of working, but still, that also leads to different types of exploitation, and again, this continuation of a two-tiered society. Also, you have this issue of cultural difference. It's employed as a bar to inclusion, always this narrative of, well, it's Ireland is very welcoming, it's just that they're not like us. In cases of individuals coming from Francophone countries, say from the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, well, they speak French, okay. But what about Nigerians? They speak English. Well, they're just culturally not like us. And so eventually their children, though, are going to Irish schools. They're sounding like Dubliners. They're playing, a Gaelic football and Comedy in school. And there's still this talk that somehow they're not like us, but they're culturally Irish. So again, we know the fast reduction would be not to cultural difference, but to racism. They are Black, and that is the core difference, even if it can go unsaid or is masked by cultural difference in that sense. But with that, you have communities still emerging. And this is just a snapshot I have of various photos that I've taken of the community that I took at the beginning of that community. And you see 4 of them on the top are along Moore Street, in that area. And Moore Street, of course, at the time was going through a transition from its traditional space of market, people selling wares, traditional Irish fishmongers and so forth in the community. It was in transition to pretty much be removed, that part of the community, but then new African migrants were moving in to those spaces and trying to use them for different types of businesses, restaurants. You see hair salons, you see a nail salon here, and then on the bottom, these shots are from Parnell Street. The little blue building is Tropical Store, which became very popular at the time, just down from North Great George's Street on Parnell. And then across the street from that, there was the Hairport, which was a place where you had individuals, Blacks and going to get their hair done in a space that didn't have a lot of shops for Black hair at the time in Ireland, so very different. So you had also a series of firsts and inaugurals. Amidst all these tensions, the first things were happening. Things were changing in Ireland, and Blacks were experiencing the first of many opportunities and many happenings. And of course, there were always other firsts. It's not new to have those firsts. First big rock star of Ireland certainly is Phil Lynott, right? And he becomes the Jimi Hendrix of Ireland, right, in various forms. Those of you who are classic rock fans, of course, know Thin Lizzy and The Boys Are Back in Town, all those other Whiskey in a Jar and so forth. Anybody want to sing a tune out there? I can't hear you. And then, of course, we have Paul Mcgrath here, one of the greatest footballers and certainly Irish footballers. Certainly has a story of the vicissitudes of his life that are really exciting, but in very much a tale of what it was like to be in mid-20th century Ireland and to be Black, and the various spaces of marginalization, of violence, ways in which kids ended up in orphanages and so forth. Those tales are part of his legacy. But having Black presence, of course, is not new. It's not just the 19th century, it's the mid-20th century as well. And then with that, we have many firsts. I popped some of the firsts here, just looking at them quickly. These are noted between September 2000 and September 2001. You had the first public anti-racism protest, right, by the African community, and that occurred after a Nigerian teenager was beaten in a Parnell Street chip shop. And so you see that happen, and protesting police inattention to this and to prior racist attacks, demonstrators marched down O'Connell Street to the Fitzgibbons Garda Station. The first television program produced about the changing face of Ireland, called Mono, which had a Nigerian Irish now co-commentator, BC Adegon, and the first African community-oriented magazine, Heritage, the first website for and about Africans, africansmagazine.com emerges. The first African-owned trendy lounge and cafe called Forum was just down at the corner of North Great Georgia Street and Parnell. The first Black cast member on a national television drama, more about that in a moment. And the first anniversary of Metro Erin, the monthly newspaper founded in April 2000 by two Nigerian Irish, Chinedu Onyejelum and Abel Ugba, and Abel actually is an interesting example too, and Chinedu as well, of journalists finding a space in Ireland and continuing to be journalists, but also advancing this idea that communities can be represented through various forms of media and writing. And the best way to advance change is through those types of representations. So they employ their skills as journalists, as writers, as thoughtful activists to this, which is a very major part of the story of Ireland at the top of the 20th century. 21st century rather. Representation matters, and that is the key. Representation is what matters. Without community representation, others will represent you in your absence of representation. That sounds almost like a tautology, but it is so true. And that, of course, is why change starts to occur in Ireland in various forms. There's Metro Erin. This particular one is from 2004. I just put this up. You'll see former Justice Minister Michael McDowell, Ireland is not racist, he says, in 2004. And this is amidst various policies that are making it harder to regularize Blacks in Ireland and increases of violence at the particular time. But that happened to be in that edition. There's Africans Magazine, the hard copy of it, but also online, again, top of the 21st century, everybody's going into websites. This period has lots of texting and mobile phones. It predates our world of Facebook, even MySpace. But here you have these kinds of media interventions, if you will. And this reflects the community, hair shops and different experiences, beauty, a different perspective from the more political and social action scene in Metro Erin. And this is a pages, African ethnic minority business pages. So again, trying to connect different businesses, this emerges at the time, so very interesting. And with that as well, going back to firsts, we have in media, I noted Mono, the show that BC Adegon hosted, but also at the time in theater, in the world of theater, Dublin actress Aoibhinn Gilroy starts the Black Actors Workshop, and Aoibhinn, who is white, is very interested in creating a space for Black actors, and that's what she does. And as a field researcher, I was in there as well. And if you look a little closely here, I'll get to this line. Since its inception in February of this year, and this is from 2001, the success of the Black Actors Workshop has been evident. It has been approached by film and television producers looking for Black actors for their projects. The first Black actress on Fair City, New Yorker Elisa Joy White, recently cast to Nigerians from the, passed through Gilroy's workshops, while Druid Theatre Company in Galway, recently cast two Nigerians from the workshop for a rehearsed reading of a play and so forth. So you start to see this happening at the time in really interesting ways. For me as a field researcher, it was very odd. And those of you who do this kind of work in the field know that there are times when you're doing participant observation and it takes different turns in various ways. And because I am, yes, a proud member of SAG-AFTRA, that is the union, Screen Actors Guild here in the United States. I do have another side of my life, I guess, and I was employing that in this context, but it was a wonderful time to get into the belly of the beast, RTE, the belly of production, because during the time, RTE had a multicultural mandate of sorts to bring in more people of color, and you saw that with the mono production, and here, these are from the RTE archives. I'm with actor Keith Irwin, and there I am. We're described as Irish actors here. So not my other New Yorker identity, nor my Californian one, but there you are. And I was playing the character Venus O'Brien. So here, from the inside, I can say that constructing a character, a Black character, initially she was, we can talk about this during the Q&A if anybody has questions. I don't want to go on about it. It's a footnote in my book because I don't like to get into it so much, but the idea of having Venus, of course, that emerges from the tennis players who were in the US who were becoming popular. Venus certainly becomes well known globally. And then initially the character's name was supposed to be Mahogany on the back of a character played by Diana Ross in the 1970s in a film. So interesting as Ireland tried to navigate this particular moment. And somehow I became a first in this context in a rather unusual way. And there we have these kinds of things that happen. And with that too, we have the Irish Voice, which is based in New York, doing a story in 2001, Black and White in Ireland. An African-American tells her personal story. And that is because, and this was on some tabloids in Ireland, I mentioned that I had experienced racism. And of course that becomes, oh yeah, okay, we've got to put something on a paper about that. And that appeared in some tabloids there. But for me as a researcher, I was interested too in voicing that. And I got letters from people who had experienced it, but also examining the way RTE was navigating this question. Today, as we look at it contemporarily, this is from last year, August, and you see here Demi Isaac Obiahwe, who plays in a show called The Young Offenders, played in a show called The Young Offenders. And she's saying not enough Black representation on Irish TV. So still in 2020, 20 years later, this is still a problem. And that's something we have to think about. What is this about representation? Why there isn't a place for Blacks in the space of media production? And why even when there was it somebody from the US, an American, and not somebody who was of Ireland, living in Ireland, attempting to be a resident of Ireland or homegrown in Ireland, right, in that context. And also Pamela Uba, first Black Miss Ireland, reveals she's suffered racism and bullying since winning. This is from September 2021. This was in Sky News, and she talks about that. So these are the kinds of conditions that we see 20 years later after anybody who wants to argue that somehow these individuals are not culturally Irish will be looked at in absurd ways, considering most of them have lived all of their lives or were born in Ireland. And there are different ways in which Ireland still embraces Blackness, but this in the context of its best and brightest, maybe? And no, not at all, because famous people are still not finding their way unless they're coming from America again. And here we have, of course, Moneygall, ancestral home of Barack Obama. And he was very much embraced and continues to be embraced in Ireland. And here you have Barack Obama Plaza. If you cruise through that space between County Tipperary and County Offaly, you can see this representation. Stop at the Spar, Bewley's, and have a tea. But again, Barack Obama can matter in particular context, but individuals who are living in Ireland, Black individuals in Ireland, do not have that representation. So it comes down to, it's no longer about welcoming. Okay, people are here. And here you have the Irish Network Against Racism engaging in this question day in and day out. I'm putting this up because I'm being a bit cheeky too. Welcome to the Irish Network Against Racism. So there are other ways of being welcoming and different ways. And ENAR has this way to report and report racism and document these circumstances, because if you don't document them, people operate under the illusion that there's no problem. And the reality is that communities are emerging. This is Ike J, who's an R&B artist representing Irish hip hop. certainly at the core of a new Black identity, Black Irish identity, Afro-Irish identity. Here you have something from the Red Bull platform, Meet the Irish Artists, using 90s R&B to find their own identity. And with that, you see their Irish artists, growing movement of Irish artists defining their Black femininity with the help of classic 90s and noughties R&B. So again, looking back to that period to claim their identity, but again, solidly, we're seeing Black identity is at the core of what it is to be Irish for so many individuals in 2021, in a way it wasn't in 2001. So welcoming is easy, and I'll conclude here, but it's the belonging that's hard. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Elisa. That was basically a trip down memory lane for me, who has been very much involved in research in Dublin all through this period. And I had so many, I guess, emotions flitting across me with the names you mentioned and the incidents you mentioned and that particular story. Ireland has changed a lot and hasn't changed at all. Racism is still a problem in Irish society, as it is in all of the Western and white-dominated societies. African Irish people have become 1% of the Irish population. Most of them are now Irish citizens. The issue now, again, is for their full inclusion in what it means to be Irish, front and center. The issues of leadership, all those issues you mentioned are very, very pertinent ones. I would say that there's been this incredible flourishing of African Irish culture in the last few years in music, but also in literature. Yesterday at the Dublin Book Festival, I shared a panel with Melato Oki Okori, who is one of the finest writers in Ireland, a brilliant short story writer, but she went through the direct provision system as a Nigerian asylum seeker as well. So the stories she has to tell are about the experiences of her life are very much chime with what you're talking about. Ireland, so much change is taking place. I look at my own classroom now as a university teacher, and I see basically the children, African Irish children of the people you're talking about, the people you would have met, you know, back around the early 2000s, are now in my university classrooms, as it should be. And hopefully they are the future leaders of our country. I think the Black Lives Matter protests in America had a huge energizing effect on Irish people, in the sense that maybe there were these anti-racism campaigns at the early part of the 21st century, at a time when maybe an equality discourse dominated the United States. But I would say an equality discourse dominates Ireland that is very much about economic meritocracy rather than anti-racism. But what we have seen in particular since Black Lives Matter is this kind of awareness of racism as a major problem for all of us. And I think the younger generation, both white and Black, are quite mobilized about this in ways that we wouldn't have seen before. And I think to some extent, Black Lives Matter had an impact of putting an awful lot of Black Irish artists, Black Irish writers, models, and other people into the newspapers. There would have been the occasional exotic kind of pieces you spoke about. But now basically you'll find them that there's an awful lot more cultural commentary, more journalists, and so on and so forth. But still, the inclusion of African Irish people and immigrants more generally in our society is a challenge for us. You know, it is an ongoing project for all of us. And of course, racism is a problem in our society and we don't take it seriously enough. So what I'd love to do now is to try and open up perhaps to some of the questions from the floor. I don't know if I can see the sort of comments that are coming up here, chat comments. So basically, yes, thank you, Elisa, for sharing your experience. Basically, people are recommending poetry from various writers. A lot of thanks for your presentation. Comments that the direct provision system you spoke about, the warehousing of asylum seekers, is still in existence. Yes, there are political commitments to deal with it. However, COVID hasn't helped. There's a housing crisis in Ireland that it hasn't helped. And perhaps the political will to do something about it isn't strong enough.
Yeah, I just wanted to note, yes.
All of those things are there.
Yeah, and I know the plan now is to have direct provision over by 2024. But yeah, we'll see what happens. And just to note, I do continue to write about Ireland beyond the period that I'm discussing here. today. But yeah, most certainly this repetition of the same circumstances, even as we see more of a Black presence in positions of visibility beyond that of asylum seeker, we still have these problems and they persist.
Yeah. And have you thought about doing follow-up work? I mean, I know you've done some observational work and you've certainly commented on recent developments in Irish society, but would you ever contemplate doing further field work in Ireland?
I have done some,
Oh, great.
and after say 2013, and
Hmm.
I even have actually a chapter, another. I'll do a shameless plug. This is probably backwards. I think it's going to
Go
appear
with the
backwards.
shameless plugs, please.
Yeah, I think it might appear backwards. I can't tell how I'm mirroring, but Relating Worlds of Racism. It's a co-edited volume, dehumanizing belonging and the normativity of European whiteness. And in this, I have a chapter that looks at Ireland also in comparison to Spain and their mutual yet different kinds of marginalization that's experienced in the context of Europe and even European whiteness. So yes, I continue to look, though admittedly I'm doing a lot more work in Spain these days. But,
right, okay. That's very interesting. And do you see parallels between what, say, is happening in Spain in terms of the settlement of, say, migrants, 21st century migrants from Africa there, and with Ireland, or is it handling itself playing out very differently in Spain?
I'm going to just give the short answer very differently, just so we can, we'll focus on Ireland here. But I certainly very differently and for certain reasons. But the idea is that both spaces under the Franco era in Spain, and then obviously in terms of years of Irish subjectivity in the British context, both of them have had to negotiate their presence in Europe and negotiate their presence in the context of European whiteness. So. Yeah.
I wasn't aware that you were Venus O'Brien.
Yeah,
in the Irish soap opera, which is Fair City.
Yes.
Which would be one of the more watched television programs in Ireland.
Yes, and it's still running. And you know what's interesting is that at the time, because of that mandate, also there was a character called Ashti who came on, played by Paul Tilech, actor Paul Tilech, who was Ashti, a Kurdish refugee. And so we were I guess, two multicultural interventions in the series that time. And I remember flying back to London one time, and he was on the same flight. We were on Ryanair on the flight back to London. And I said, oh my gosh, if this plane goes down, there goes all the multiculturalism in Carrickstown. So,
and Carrickstown is
Carrickstown is the community that's not real, but it could be because it's lasted a very long time.
Well, it's an imagined community, as we say in sociology.
Yes,
but actually, it has manifestations in the phenomenal world. I wonder, would anybody like to speak? I don't know what it's like in terms of bringing in voices and whether people have voice control. But if anybody would like to speak directly to Elisa at this stage, because I'm just conscious how, in an ideal world, we'd be in a room together and we would have the chat and the companionship of one another. Does anybody want to maybe break in and try and have to say something?
I think Kim wants to break in there, Brian.
Lovely, that would be fantastic. Hello, Kim.
Hi, Brian. I have a question, but I actually want to note one comment that was made earlier by Rosemary Adasser, and without reading the whole
Rosemary.
Yeah, because part of her comment is noting the ways that Black people in Ireland have been there far longer than even, the past 2 decades or even mid-century. Yes. And she talks about anti-racist responses to, or the framing of anti-racism prior to this latest wave of African migration in terms of traveler communities, but also noting the presence of mixed race Irish, children of African migrants of an earlier wave. And I wonder if you could just note the ways that you incorporate that experience in your research.
Yeah, as far as I'm just thinking about the traveler community, it's always paired with the anti-racist movements at the time, particularly where you had Pobby Point and spaces of activism around communities who are in movement, the travelers, and the way they are racialized in the context of Ireland and negatively racialized. And so there are those tensions. I think we get into the discussion of the extent of measuring the quality of violence against the community. And I'm not going to compare spaces of violence, but I will say that at the time, the conspicuous nature of the experience of Blackness for the first time, where you have travelers who are more of an indigenous community, created a distinction in terms of how they, Blacks versus, say, travelers, navigated racism in the society, in Irish society at the time, top of the 20th century. But as far as those mid-century moments, particularly in the 19th century, but yes, certainly in the 18th century, there are even, I've documented what were described as sightings of Blacks. It would be noted in a paper, somebody saw a Black man. But what was interesting to me is that in the 21st century, when I was there, people would talk about growing up in the 20th century and seeing a Black person for the first time. And there was this novelty in it, which also created this kind of retrogressive quality to me, because I thought, well, wow, you know, you get to London and there are people of color, even amidst certain tensions. They're not an anomaly or an unusual exoticized moment, a sighting. But the 18th century, there were sightings, and certainly that continued. In the 19th century, though, this idea of individuals, say, those who came, particularly Nigerians who came to the Royal College of Surgeons, right, met women, white Irish women, and had children, and those children were often whisked off to, as we know, to horror houses, sometimes called the Sisters of Mercy, and other places, you know, into the orphanages, right? And were not to be seen, and grew up in very violent circumstances in terms of their neglect and the violence against the racist violence against them, because they did not fit into what Irishness was, and they fit into a context of shame and intermixing. So yes, yeah, and that's part of some of the work that I've considered.
Yeah, and I'd like to say that Rosemary, in particular, who you spoke about there, Rosemary Elisa, has been at the forefront of activism, you know, aimed at basically understanding the lives of Black Irish people who grew up in care, you know, who had all the horrendous experiences of other children who were in the care system at the time, the coercive care system, but they also had the experiences of racism that were not acknowledged, not understood, and still not properly recognized. And even when we had, you know, in the last year or so, a major report out on the experiences of people in those care homes, I don't think that that report thoroughly grasped the nature and extent of the kinds of racism and racialized experience that people like Rosemary, who grew up during that, experienced.
Yeah,
and I think there's an awful lot of work to do to recover and to understand and to basically learn from those experiences of racism. It's very important for us as Irish people to understand that we are not exempt from being racist, that we have a history that is very much part of the racism of the West, that we are capable of racializing others, including immigrants, and have done so in relation to minorities for many generations whenever it was possible for us to do so. So,
yeah, and I think if I just,
you know,
I'm going to cut in there, because I just want to add to that. I mean, that is a part of the major issue of considering. Obviously, we think about it in terms of intersectionality. We can think about it in terms of an additive effect of one's gender, one's race, one's status, migration status. All of these are intersectional circumstances that must be teased out as we understand what is happening in that process of negative racialization. That's part of it. But certainly the larger issue is that we need to also have researchers who are aware of those circumstances and doing the work in whether it's in sociology, anthropology, in political science, looking at it in various forms, understanding those intersectional experiences for Black and Brown communities, particularly Blacks in Ireland. And yes, the extra note is, of course, that issue of Irish excusing themselves from the arena of global racism is an absurdity. And that's why from the beginning, we have to think about the way that idea that we were philanthropists was the refrain. We are the space of welcomes, but you're not if you're welcoming is contingent upon how one is racialized.
Yeah, there's been an awful lot of good work done in recent years about basically things such as, well, you take, for example, Irishness and racism. I mean, if you look at, say, Irish America and a lot of the American right. If you look at the kinds of people who online, talk about the kind of, talk against Black Lives Matter by arguing that the Irish were somehow more oppressed than Black people. There's an awful lot of improbable stuff associated with being Irish and the performance of Irish identity that it plays out as racism that we need to challenge. I mean, one of the points that a wonderful local historian kind of called Liam Hogan made the point, and he's done enough of research on slavery, and he looked at who owned slaves who were Irish. So what he did is he went and looked at the slave registers at the time of manumission in the States, at the time of, when slavery came to an end in the United States, but also at the British Empire, and looked at all the owners of the slaves and looked at surnames of the slave owners. And most, many Irish surnames were listed amongst the slave owners in the United States and also in the British Empire.
Yeah,
pretty much every Irish, my surname,
I just want to make
sure
sure
who had my surname were slave owners.
Yeah.
In America or in the British Empire. People called McMahon, people called, all the Irish Taoiseach, the leaders of Ireland, all of those surnames basically, had people who were slave owners. Now,
they were, Irish people
Irish
enslaved.
people were very complicit in basically in all of this too, and the extent to which basically Ireland Ireland can't be viewed as somehow magically exempt from racism just because Ireland also experienced a version of colonialism. So we ourselves owe to ourselves and to our children and to all of us in our diverse republic to unearth this history. And just going back to Rosemary, I said I would like to applaud her, especially for the courage of her work as an activist and what she's done over the years.
Yeah, we have a couple of raised hands.
Yeah, Rosemary actually has her hand raised there. Brian, you may not be able.
Oh, hello everybody. Wonderful discussion. Brian, it's lovely to see your face, and Elisa, it's also wonderful to see an African American woman become so interested in the connections between Ireland and the African diaspora. I suppose the point I wanted to make, one of the difficulties that my community were shamed and hidden in these industrial schools and within the Irish industrial school complex, which includes mother and baby institutions, industrial schools, Magdalene laundries. One of the reasons was that we had a bloodline link to Irish identity, that new refugees or the new Irish, as they call it, a dreadful term, because how long do you have to be in a country before you can claim its citizenship? But I think one of the problems is that there's always been a tension between those of us born in Ireland with at least one Irish parent. And don't forget, if you're Irish in America and you've never set foot in Ireland, you can claim Irish citizenship in a way that people of African descent not born in Ireland do not have that automatic right to. So there is, if you like, I've always found that the position of my community, mixed race Irish, and I've known elders in their 80s, born and raised in Ireland. Jude Hughes is in his 80s, also a great man. But the point is this, we had an automatic right to citizenship. When I went for my Irish citizenship, I was directed to the alien department. There was a real conundrum going on there, but thank you both very much. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. I'd love to hear your voice.
Thank you. And thank you, Rosemary. Thank you for that comment, because that is another issue of the types of tiers of identity and recognition in various contexts, and those tensions in terms of who belongs and who doesn't in the state. And it has a very violent resonance in various forms of abuse and human rights abuse in particular.
I see another raised hand there, Burka Cafe, is that right? If I'm pronouncing your name, apologies if I'm not, because I'm mispronouncing all day today.
Yeah. Thank you for the chance. I would like to appreciate the forum organizers, and I'm really impressed also by the white paper. But I have a question for her. Kind of like I see some gaps in relation to the new Irish. What do you think about the Muslims? Do you have anything to say? Thank you very much.
And when you say the new Irish in terms of the Muslims, are you? Could you explain a bit further when you ask me what do I think about?
I saw your focus. I can see from a bit focused on Nigerians, mostly Nigerians.
Okay, in terms of the
Nigerians and also the culture, kind of I can see them a kind of Christian backgrounds, but
I
there
got
are a
okay.
lot of Muslims
Yes,
in
there are.
Ireland,
No, thank you, thank you,
which
Burka.
deserve some. Do you think they deserve? How
I
how do you see
agree.
it? Do you
I understand.
the
No, I
Muslim need
understand now.
a separate chapter in your book? Do we need it? Thank you.
Yeah.
In my book, I do not, in the book that I'm discussing today in 2000, 2001, and thank you for clarifying. I just wanted to make sure that you were talking about the African diaspora community specifically. I do not extensively look at religious communities. I found that Abel Ugba, whom I mentioned earlier, had done extensive work on religious communities, particularly storefront Pentecostal churches that were emerging at the time and so forth. But that doesn't answer your question about the Muslim community. During the time that I'm looking at, the community was predominantly you had Igbo and Yoruba and some Hausa from Nigeria in that particular context. And then other communities represented in other spaces of the diaspora. But the issue of particularly how Muslim communities were integrated into the larger discourse of Blackness was not to the fore at the time, because 2000, 2001 is this period just predates 9/11. Okay, or 11/9, depending on what you say, the 11th of September, which is very significant as we think about global engagements with racism and xenophobia, some would define it, that's problematic and in various forms in the context of Muslims. So I don't extensively deal with that or address that in the book. I address the fact that communities are there. There's some interviews that I have, certainly of individuals who are Muslim. So my question you're asking me today, what do I think? And I can certainly say in the post September 11th context and in the context of other spaces of populism that has had an impact on various communities, certainly who are not racialized as white. We see that certainly there's Black communities are meeting at that intersection, again, speaking of intersectionality, of being Muslim, being Black, and then being, regardless of your generation, being perceived as other or external or foreign to the spaces of Ireland. I'll say specifically for our purposes here, but we see this manifested globally. Does that answer some of what you're looking at?
Yeah, I see I see I see there are still some gaps. My question is, are you going to do additional work in relation to Muslims, separate from the Igbos, the Hausas, the kind of the Muslim aspect of them?
I want to put it out there to another research. I want to put it out there to another researcher, maybe somebody at the other UCD, I'll say here.
Thank you very much.
To go on and do this work.
Thank you.
So you're out there, please do the work.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that comment, Burka, because again, there's so much work to be done and from within the community. I don't know what your research area is, Burka, or your interest, but I would encourage you to do work too. And I'm not trying to make work for anybody in any particular way, but I think those questions need to be asked. And I'm not the one to do the work.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I'm conscious of time, but there's a question there, Brian. I don't know whether Steve Small, I know Steve knows Elisa well, and Steve was one of our moderators last week. I don't know, Steve, if you have the capacity to unmute yourself. Do you want to pose the question yourself?
And Steve.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Stephen,
good to see you, Elisa. Can you hear me
so
okay?
Good to see. I can, and I just have to say, and Stephen was my dissertation supervisor at Berkeley.
Thanks for that, Elisa.
Yes.
Fascinating presentation and fascinating responses I've seen in the chat. My question is about the definition of racism. My former professor, Michael Banton, said that one of the problems with analyses of racism is that it suffers from conceptual inflation, whereas everything everywhere is racist. So in the question, I put that we've called England and Liverpool racist, we've called South Africa racist, we've called the United States racist. So to call Ireland the Republic racist, what's our definition of racism vis-a-vis, for example, institutional racism, or the typical default, which is prejudice? How do we define racism? How do we measure it? And how would we identify a non-racist society if such a thing exists? Not an easy question, but I'd welcome some of your thoughts.
I love this question because this is something that I think I grapple with and with my students in the classroom. Not only am I teach a Black European Studies course at UC Davis, again, the other UCD, and I grapple with this question, particularly after the summer of 2020, the question of how we define racism, how its experience gets challenged in various forms. And I've never, in my own analysis, and I know you know from my work back in the day, it's not for me about prejudice. I think that becomes a superficial engagement. I think it's about systemic racism, and even more so that acknowledgement of it and how it's functional in very global contexts is important. In the book that I was just shamelessly plugging there, Relating Worlds of Racism, my co-editors have various ways in which racisms are experienced and in various societies. And sometimes it comes through the lens of different types of structural violence in the sense of not having access to employment, education, and so forth. Sometimes it comes in more tangible physical spaces of violence. Sometimes it's an intersection, but they're all manifestations of systemic neglects of the way that one community is privileged over another, one community is advantaged, and it comes through the lens of racialization. Again, getting back to the issue of negative racialization. So to answer the question, I mean, for me, it's always about engaging with the plurality of racism. And there are ways in which it is experienced, and acknowledging that analytically is, to me, a way of understanding how racism is specific to different communities and can be overcome in various ways. And I don't mean that in a kind of a mid-20th century, we shall overcome way. It is more the way if societies do wish to not live in contexts in which there are disadvantages that are racialized, then the advantage would be to get beyond that and find policies. And of course, we don't live in that utopia anywhere in this society, in our global society. So there's no answer to what that society looks like free of racism. I can't even see it. So maybe some other visionaries in the crowd can consider it, but I don't think it can be reduced to even a utopian understanding. That's science fiction, and that's interesting. But there are too many layers of the way racism is systemically experienced to even get to that.
So with that, we're going to have to leave it there. We're over time. That went in a flash. Elisa, I want to thank you so much for your presentation and your work. And Brian, for just doing such a great job moderating. And for all the questions, thank you so much. They leave us with a lot to think about. We will take a break right now and come back at noon. We're going to close this session. You'll have to reconnect when Shante Luton-Kinyon will speak about the ties that bind resistance, rebellion, and redemption in Uptight, moderated by Anna McCarthy from NYU. So again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you
very much.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Elisa. Thank you, Brian. That was wonderful.